All right, well, let's get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I hope everyone's settled in with their, it looks like, sub sandwiches, which I did not get one of, but I'm very jealous. I'll get one after the event. My name is Kevin Corinth. I am a senior fellow and deputy director of the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility, or COSM, here at AEI. I'm excited to welcome you here because 2 hours ago, the United States Census Bureau just released some very important data, official estimates of income and poverty pertaining to 2024. The data are extremely important. It's worth noting that we spend a lot of time dissecting other government data series, and rightly so, from the monthly jobs numbers that tell us about the labor market, from inflation data that the Federal Reserve monitors in order to monitor the price level, and changes in the price level, and economic output and GDP estimates. I would argue that the income and poverty numbers that were released today are some of the most important numbers because they tell us, with some lag, about whether US households are doing better today than they were in previous years. We can answer questions like, is the middle class doing better than they were in previous decades? Is poverty falling? What about gaps between people of different races and ethnicities and genders? The data released today are particularly important because they tell us a few important things for policymakers. One is that we've received data for 2024, which marks the end of the Biden administration era, which was characterized by substantial policy responses to COVID and otherwise, as well as very high inflation and a leveling off of the labor market in terms of coming back down to normal levels of unemployment rates. 2024 will also be a baseline for the Trump administration. We've already seen a lot of action in terms of the administration's policies on tariffs, on immigration, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was passed, which has big implications for the tax code, as well as safety net programs, which are determinant of poverty rates. So we should expect that things will change as years go on, and this will be very important to have 2024 as a baseline. So we'll get to the new numbers in a moment, and I'll be presenting some of the highlights for those who missed the Census Bureau's presentation this morning at 10 o'clock. But I'd first like to introduce our speakers before I get into those numbers. Sitting immediately to my right is Scott Winship. Scott is a senior fellow and the director of the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility here at AEI, where he researches social mobility and the causes and effects of poverty. He previously served as the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, where he created the Social Capital Project. He was also previously a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and served in other important positions. He has testified before Congress and has been published widely in the popular press. He holds a PhD in social policy from Harvard University. Further from my right is Matt Weidinger. Matt is a senior fellow and Rose Scholar in Opportunity and Mobility Studies here at AEI, where his work is focused on safety net policies, including cash welfare, child welfare, disability benefits, and unemployment insurance. He previously served as the Deputy Staff Director of the House Committee on Ways and Means and Staff Director of the Subcommittee on Human Resources. He holds an MA in Political Science from the University of Chicago. Finally, they're not sitting here, but I'd like to note our deep appreciation for the Census Bureau staff who collect the data that we'll be talking about today. They report its findings and communicate them to the public. We're indebted to their service and commitment to the highest quality and trustworthy data possible. Okay, so with that, I will get to my slides, which again, are just gonna briefly hit on the highlights of the Census Bureau's numbers from today. And then throughout our discussion, we'll bring out some other numbers and then what they mean for going backward in terms of historical and Biden era policies and then moving forward into the new policy environment. Okay, here we go. So first, one of the major highlights is, of course, the median household income estimates. Median household income tracks sort of how households at the middle of the distribution are doing, sort of the middle class. And this is household income, so it's all income received by individuals who live in a given house together. You can see here the historical trend going back to 1968. I think it's actually 1967. It's not labeled on the chart. But you see that in 2024, median household income increased by 1.3%. So that's a one-year increase. It was not statistically significant, but it did represent about a $1,000 increase in median household income. And this is adjusted for inflation. It's also notable that while there was an increase this year, over the past 4 or 5 years, it hasn't been a substantial increase relative to the pre-COVID peak. Next, poverty rates. So the Census Bureau collects income data, which can be used to measure poverty. Poverty means that your income is below a specified threshold. We'll get into this a lot, but there's something called the official poverty measure, which includes many, but not all sources of income. It basically includes all cash or money income, but excludes, does not account for taxes or refundable tax credits like the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit. It also does not include any in-kind transfers like food stamps or SNAP, housing assistance, and medical assistance like Medicaid and Medicare. Okay, so according to the official poverty measure, we saw a decrease in poverty in 2024, a 0.5 percentage point decrease from 11.1 to 10.6%. Again, that was not quite as low as it was in 2019 when it was 10.5%, but it is a reduction relative to where it was last year. Finally, I just want to highlight the supplemental poverty measure, which is a different poverty measure that the Census Bureau publishes each year. It does include an expanded set of resources in its income measure. So in addition to counting cash income like market earnings, it also adjusts for taxes, both subtracting tax liabilities and including refundable tax credits. It includes some, but not all in-kind transfers. So it includes SNAP or food stamps and housing assistance, as well as things like school meals. It does not, however, include the value of health insurance, including Medicaid. According to the supplemental poverty measure, there was no change in poverty in 2024. It stayed exactly the same at 12.9% in 2023 and 2024. So with that, I want to open things up for some discussion and get into some of these numbers as well as the other numbers that were underlying the report. So I just want to start by sort of asking both Scott and then Matt, sort of what to you are the major headlines or takeaways in these numbers? Are there any surprises or things that are sort of the take home for those journalists and policymakers out there who are trying to make sense of what's going on? So Scott, I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Kevin. And thanks everyone for coming, pleasure to be here. So to me, I'm always wary, I think the temptation on days like this are to try to explain, what's usually a pretty small change from the previous year. I think, especially having had 2 hours to analyze the data, that's always a risk, I think, to come up with strong theories about why something moved 0.6 of a percentage point in 1 year versus another. What I have tried to think more about is with the 2024 data, we now can look back 5 years to 2019, which was a business cycle peak. It was kind of it lasted right up until the COVID pandemic in 2020. But it's a useful benchmark to think about where are we today. A lot has happened. It's maybe the biggest understatement you'll hear this morning. A lot has happened since 2019. We obviously had a pandemic that came with an unprecedented amount of federal aid that went out the door. Some of it targeted, some of it not at all targeted. When the Biden administration came in, they continued and even expanded on those policies in many ways. That was followed by a big bout of inflation that we can argue, but was probably at least not helped by the amount of aid that went out the door in the preceding couple of years. We went through another change in the presidency. So, and I should say too, the Trump presidency, and to some extent the Biden presidency, especially to the extent that it involved bringing in a lot of Bernie Sanders staffers. There's been this conversation about populism, economic populism, in a lot of ways. Whether the economy is still working for people. Are we in late stage capitalism? To use one popular quote. And so when I looked at the numbers today, I was kind of having that as a backdrop and trying to think about, well, what does it really tell us about where we're at? And I think it's a surprisingly positive message in a lot of ways. I think that comes through in the income statistics. So the year-to-year changes haven't been that large in the last couple of years. But it remains the case, the chart Kevin just showed you, median household income is at an all-time high by the official statistics. And we'll get into a little bit of methodological wonkery probably later on, but if we had better measures than I think what the official ones are, that would indicate to an even greater extent that median household income is higher than it's ever been before. That's also true of median family income, if you just were looking at families out there. It's also true of median earnings for women. It's also true of median earnings for men. These are all at all-time highs, which I think is really surprising if you believe the talk that's out there around how the economy is failing everybody. We need to reshore manufacturing. We need to change fundamentally our trade policies because people are being left behind in the economy today. That extends to when we look at the poverty numbers. And here I think the story actually ends up being really complicated. And we're going to talk a fair amount about that too, I think. But if let's skip ahead to this slide of mine. I showed a chart like this, I think, maybe last year, maybe a couple of years ago. This is just looking at sort of what's happened to poverty over the last 10 years and the different stories you can tell with the measures that are out there. And it's, really confusing, I think, even if you're a wonk who looks at these numbers. So start with the green line, which is the official poverty measure. That declined in 2024, leaving it essentially where it was in 2019. It's a tenth of a percentage point higher than it was in 2019. But basically 2019 was an all-time low for the official poverty measure, and we're back there today. So that's positive. As Kevin mentioned, there's a bunch of problems with the official poverty measure. I don't think that's actually probably the best way to think about what's happened to poverty. If you move to the red trend line, that's the supplemental poverty measure that Kevin mentioned, which basically was unchanged from last year, which leaves it higher than the SPM was in 2019. You can see that all of the aid that went out in 2020 and 2021 lowered poverty, and when that aid then was scaled back, it went up in 2022, and it stayed higher, a little bit higher than in 2019, but still lower than pretty much any year before 2019. For a variety of reasons, like that's not the right way to look at what happened to poverty recently either. The main one being that the thresholds determining who's in poverty by this supplemental poverty measure are based on how much people spend over a 5-year period that doesn't include 2024. And so what happened between 2023 and 2024 is that window where the thresholds are determined by how much people are spending. Basically, it got rid of a low inflation year and it added a high inflation year. And so the thresholds all went up. It became harder to escape SPM poverty as a result. And so you see SPM poverty kind of stagnating. The dark blue line is a different version of the SPM where the thresholds are held constant except for the year-to-year change in the cost of living. And the 2024 line I've kind of extended based on the trend in the official poverty measure, but you can see even in 2023 that went down even as the official SPM went up. So I think by a measure that included the strengths of the SPM but not the shortcomings of it, you would have seen a decline in poverty. That would leave the poverty rate lower than at any point except, again, in 2020 and 2021. And then if that wasn't confusing enough, you can look at the yellow line, which is a consumption poverty measure from our colleague Bruce Meyer and colleagues of his. They haven't updated that since 2022, but you can see as of 2022, it kept going down even after all of the massive federal aid from 2020 and 2021 went away. Why is that? Well, because that aid was so massive that it was more than what people needed at the time. It was more than they wanted to spend. They saved it, they paid down debt, and consumption poverty, which is just based on how much you're spending, continue to go down. The interesting stat there is from 2019 to 2024, the income in the bottom fifth of households increased by 6%. If you look at what happened to the wealth of the bottom fifth of households by income, so the same group in theory, that went up by 25%. And so people have been sitting on a little bit of a cushion, and that has also helped as some of the federal aid went away. So by a consumption poverty measure, you might find that we're much lower in terms of poverty than we've ever been before. And then finally, just to complicate things further, if you look at the light blue line, this is a measure from the Food Security Supplement about the percent of people saying that they don't have enough to eat. I've multiplied that just for scaling purposes. It's not that high. It's actually quite a bit lower than these other lines. But if you just multiply it up so that it lines up with some of the other lines better, you find that rose in 2023. The numbers normally would be out by now for 2024. It won't be out until October. But we'll see what happens when that number comes out. That might tell yet another story. So, but in general, it looks like things are near all-time lows for poverty in the United States as well. These are just stories you don't hear in the discourse these days about how we're doing as a nation, how the economy's doing, how our policy is doing.
So I want to join Kevin in thanking the people at Census. This is a difficult task. It's very complicated. It's fighting in some sense against the stream of people's lowered response rates. So last year's report, I didn't see it in this year's report, but listed some of the response rates for the month of March when most of the surveys are responded for the previous year, going back about a decade. So the response rate was 90% in 2012, 80%, 84% in 2018, 76% in 2021, down to 67% in 2024. So naturally they have ways to control for that, efforts to control for that, but these are surveys and surveys have some issues. So that's sort of the first thing to note. A couple of additional kind of obvious facts about this. What we're talking about is survey data about the last calendar year, right? So those who are looking for an analysis of the Trump administration and its effects are going to have to wait until next year's event for that one. I think this was an announcement for next year's event on this date. So you're going to have to wait a year for that. It gives these sort of a more historical feel, which I know in contemporary society is probably not the way people like to look at things. They want data now. They want it, immediately. But it's, significantly different, for example, than the monthly jobs data that has also had sort of response rate questions applied to it and revisions and things like that. This sort of is beyond some of that, but it needs to be noted we're not talking about sort of current data. And finally, I would say, sort of since this is the Trump administration, I suspect this data will be somewhat underplayed because it's not about the Trump administration, it's about the last year of the Biden administration. So we'll see how that all plays out. Kevin and Scott did a good job of sort of setting this in context in terms of like specific stuff from this report. I mean, I agree. I think this is a good report. Median income is up. Married household income was up strongly, 5% to $128,700. It's a lot of money. Even $83,000, the median for all households is a significant amount of money from, my way of looking at things. Under the official poverty measure, there was a decline in poverty. The decline was greater among households with children. It was significant among households with no high school diploma. It was even significant among those who didn't work, which is kind of confusing. And like Scott said, we'll have to dive into that a little bit more afterwards. The SPM showed different effects, I think, for many of the reasons that Scott laid out. But even there, it was flat overall, but among children, the SPM declined. Those with no high school degree declined a little bit more. In terms of the number of people in poverty, we all care a lot about children. Children were disproportionately removed from poverty in this report. So overall, the number of people in poverty declined by around 900,000. Number of kids removed from poverty declined by about 700,000. Some seniors went up, or some more seniors were in poverty, and that was matched against some working age people who were removed from poverty. I think overall, the big picture here is a strong report that I think for various reasons will probably not get the airtime that it deserves, but we'll be back at this next year to see how things have changed in the meantime.
Great, and I think kind of, obviously this is adding 1 year, 2024, to what we already knew, and so a lot of the focus has been on how did poverty change from 2023 to 2024. But obviously this paints a larger picture, and I'm gonna put on a little bit of our political hats, and as I mentioned earlier, we now have all 4 years of the Biden administration of what income looked like. So here's median household income over time. You can see that starting in 2021 to 2024, or 2020 to 2024, there was a small increase in median household income. And actually, as of 2024, finally, median household income exceeded what it was in 2019, although just barely. And so I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about, what does this tell us about the 4 years of the Biden administration? Obviously, there were a lot of things going on. We were just getting past COVID when former President Biden took office in January of 2021. We then had an extraordinary policy response, and some would say it wasn't a response only to the pandemic, but also because the people just wanted to do big policies. But we had a lot of temporary policies, like the child tax credit expansion in 2021, like the economic impact payments or stimulus payments, which provided large infusions of cash to American households, the extensions of unemployment insurance into that period as well. And so now we can kind of see how that played out. We can see, obviously, inflation went up a lot in the ensuing aftermath of those policies, but that's kind of come back down. The labor market stabilized. And I think the ultimate question is, what did that mean for American households? All these are kind of tidbits that feed into that overall assessment of, was this a good 4-year period for Americans? And so I'd like to ask both of you, what do you think this says about the Biden administration's policies and Congress's policies, obviously, during this past 4-year period? Were they successful as measured by, say, income and poverty? Can you glean anything about the effects of particular components of the economy during that time, and what do they tell you? So maybe I'll start with Matt this time, and then
Sure.
come back to Scott.
So I think part of the confusion whenever you have a conversation like this is, well, what are you counting, right? So this chart is pre-tax money income, which includes in-kind transfers. So it looks like we had a significant drop in median household income during the peak from 2019, dropping in 2020, getting down, I assume we're at 2022, and now 3 and 4 with rises, right? But that only counts something. It doesn't count everything. It doesn't count basically most of the massive amount of stimulus, or whatever you want to call it, that was provided during the pandemic. So this will include some of the unemployment benefits that were paid, which were paid at record levels during the pandemic. But it includes things like 3 rounds of stimulus checks. Those were something like $800 billion, and a typical family of 4 would have gotten something like $11,000 from those in 2020 and 2021. It ignores significant food stamp expansions that were provided primarily under the Biden administration, but even some growth in food stamp rolls early in the pandemic during the Trump administration. The expanded child tax credit, again, not counted in here. So it's almost like you got to look at this graph in comparison with the SPM chart, and they sort of tell a mirror, they kind of mirror each other, right? Here, median household income, not counting much of the significant assistance that taxpayers provided during the pandemic, looks like it went down and has now risen again. But if you actually account for that, and in something like the SPM, the supplemental poverty measure, well, there poverty declined sharply because of all of that additional assistance being provided. So that's kind of a complicated explanation, but that kind of anticipates some of the later discussion I think we'll probably have about some of the distinctions between the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure. So the answer to your question is, it depends.
All right, I like that answer. Scott?
Yeah, I think it's very complicated as well. I think obviously, well, the place where I would start is, I guess, to go back to 2014, which, if you're looking at that chart, is the year right after the series break there. So from 2014 to 2019, you see this very strong growth in income. Now that runs through the second Obama term. It runs through the Trump's first term. I'm not here to tell you that that trend, it reflects strongly the policies of either administration. I think it reflects the underlying strength of the American economy. I think the best thing that most policymakers can do for economic growth is not get in the way of it. I think the tax cuts, I think, probably stimulated, some of the tax cuts, I think, stimulated the economy effectively. But the economy was much stronger than we realized, I think, before COVID. Now 2020, 2021, 2022, I'd like to completely forget for any number of reasons. And I think it's really difficult to interpret even what happened, as Matt said. It looks like that was a pretty bad stretch from 2019 to 2022. If you're looking at this income chart, if you're looking at the SPM chart, you're thinking that 2020 and 2021 were we had heaven on earth briefly, and then it went away. I think if you sort of connect 2019 to 2024, clearly we are not where we would have been if we had continued seeing the strength of the 2010s economy past 2019. We don't know the counterfactual. We don't know whether that was sustainable or not. But it does seem like we're out of these kind of nightmare years and maybe getting back to normal. That said, nothing about 2025 is I would characterize as normal. And we'll get to, I think, where things are going in the future. But to me, the basic story is an underlying strong economy that temporarily was propped up by an unprecedented federal response to the pandemic, that was actually an over-response that is inextricably connected to the inflation that happened afterwards, an inflation that really determined the course of the presidential election in 2024 and has left American consumers actually more down on the economy than typically you would see, given what our unemployment rates are today. I've sort of looked at long-term trends in how people say the economy is doing compared to the unemployment rate, and they track really well until 2021 or so, and then they're just dominated by people's perceptions of inflation, and that's been the real story, I think, politically and economically of the last 3 or 4 years for sure.
Yeah, I think it's hard to understate how great 2019 was. I was working in the White House during the first Trump administration.
We can thank Kevin for 2019.
I was not going there, but you're welcome. As these numbers came out each year, it was really jarring to see how much income actually was going up, and how far down the unemployment rate had come to 3.5%, which were really historic lows at the time. Obviously, we've repeated that now in the last couple of years. But we were seeing very large wage increases at the bottom of the distribution, the historically left behind populations, and it was really being reflected in the labor market and therefore in these income growth estimates. And kind of looking back, it's you kind of take for granted how fast growth can be and how fast it can push up incomes. when you see, going from that 2019 peak to 2024, due to the ravages of inflation, you've really seen essentially no real income growth in the past 5 years. So I think it's worth not taking for granted that good economic times are not a foregone conclusion, and maybe they require certain policy responses. I've actually updated my prior beliefs. I used to think, presidents don't really matter that much for economic outcomes, but I think in recent years, I think maybe they do, and maybe we'll see what happens in the future. And that leads me to my next topic. So as we look ahead to Trump administration part 2, obviously 2016 to 2019, we did see this big increase. Obviously, COVID threw that off. President Trump has talked about sort of a golden period or a golden age of an economy where I think people look back to 2019 or something even substantially better. I think it's worth speculating on, will we see a repeat of those years? Obviously, the policy packages of Trump Part 2 are, I think, different from what we saw in Trump Part 1. Some of it's the same, I guess, in part where we saw an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, of the individual provisions that were expiring. So we're seeing sort of a continuation of those policies, and maybe partly on the deregulatory front in terms of things like energy. But we are seeing some differences as well. That includes things like tariffs, which are much more widespread this time around and larger and comprehensive. We're seeing much more action on immigration, where during the Biden last 4 years, we were seeing lots more people coming through across the border, and now we're seeing a very abrupt shift of people no longer coming through, and net migration maybe becoming negative. And we also saw, as part of the big One Beautiful Bill Act, we saw some things that could substantially affect things like poverty, including on work requirements in Medicaid being added, really community engagement requirements. We saw in SNAP a substantial strengthening of existing work requirements, including for some parents with older kids, and kind of getting rid of some of the abuse of the state waiver system that states would use to waive work requirements. So I think people would look on thinking that maybe we will have some different trajectories of household income and of poverty in the next 4 years. And so let's speculate on that. Scott, maybe you could take a part of that. I don't know if you want to start anywhere in that. Maybe just starting with your prediction of, do you think from 2024, which is our new baseline, will we see median incomes grow as quickly as we did, say, from 2016 to 2019?
Well, that seems like an easier question than one that you might have asked. I think I would feel pretty comfortable saying no, it's not going to grow that fast. And I'm sure I'll be proven wrong, but no one's going to watch this on YouTube in 5 years, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, I think, so if I go back to the first Trump administration, I think I gave a minor shout out to the tax cuts from that administration. I think some of them were pro-growth. I think there were a lot that were neutral for growth or maybe even negative for growth. Balanced out, I think the tariffs that were enacted during his first term probably slowed growth on net, and so those balanced out. I think you're kind of seeing that on steroids in the second administration, where again, I think there are things to like in the tax bill. If you talk to our colleagues here at AEI who do tax policy, none of them will have a hard time telling you like the things they like about it, but they will also not have a hard time telling you the things that they don't like about it. The main one being that it wasn't really paid for. So it's going to, as much as the deficit was exploded in 2020 and 2021 by the spending that we did, given how much spending has increased, piling on tax cuts on top of that we didn't fully pay for is going to hurt growth. We're at a point where our fiscal situation should really be alarming to everybody, I think. And the bond vigilantes will come eventually, and Higher interest rates will slow the economy. I think that's coming. I think the tariffs, as you mentioned, have been much bigger than in the first term. I think they're a terrible idea. They're going to start showing up in price increases more so than they have to date. I think already we can say that the degree of uncertainty that's been created by this kind of like, the rates are at this level. No, they're at this level. Well, I'll take them away for this country and I'll take them away for this sector. Has already hurt growth, I think, but I don't think we've begun to see the full effects yet. I'll let Matt talk about OBBA and the work requirements. The only other thing I'd say is, in an extremely mild defense of the Trump administration, I think there are new numbers that came out today in addition to the income and poverty numbers in a different part of the federal government, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, related to the employment estimates. And so each year in the fall, there's a big revision, and it was just announced at 10 o'clock this morning that job growth from March 2024 to March 2025 was lower by about half than we thought. And that's a big deal. It suggests that I think we already were getting a lot of signs the economy was slowing down so far in Trump's first term, but I think this is kind of making clear that the economy was starting to run out of steam a little bit even before Trump took office. But I think most of what he's doing is I think a lot of what he's doing is going to make it worse.
So I would kind of second that. The big effect on income, poverty, ultimately is work, family, those dynamics. Federal government, state governments kick in some, and much of it's targeted to try to alleviate that. But there are, I'd say, worrisome signs about the direction of payroll employment in recent months, and certainly the benchmark revision suggests that worry extends further back than just the last couple of months of the Trump administration. Basically, it suggests that the average monthly payroll employment growth going back for some period of time was closer to 70,000 instead of 140,000 or 150,000 as previously predicted. So we'll see where that goes. The recent trend is not positive. So that's something to pay attention to going forward. In terms of the One Big Beautiful Bill, so the question, one way to phrase Kevin's question is, at next year's event, what will we know about the effects of One Big Beautiful Bill in terms of work requirements playing their way through programs like Medicaid and food stamp? I think the answer for calendar year 2025 is going to be almost nothing. And that's for some basic sort of methodological reasons. The Medicaid community engagement requirements, work requirements, if you will, have a significantly delayed implementation. So the HHS is supposed to announce an interim rule by the middle of next year, by June 1st. By October 1st of 2026, people who could be affected are supposed to be notified, and then that's supposed to take effect on January 1st of 2027, right? So you're not going to see that play out in 2025 data. And I'll talk about how even that 2027 date could be extended. The SNAP or food stamp work requirements, same sort of thing. So here we are in September, so 2/3 of the way through 2025. Technically, the law became effective upon enactment in terms of the SNAP work requirements, but USDA just last week issued a memorandum saying, hey, we'll tell the states more about how to implement this by the end of this month. So even if that was immediately implemented, you're probably talking just a month or two or so of 2025 that would be affected by the SNAP work requirements. So the direct answer to how is that going to play out in terms of next year's job and income data, I think the answer is not very much. There, of course, are a couple of exceptions even to that sort of delayed implementation. If we enter a recession, first thing Congress does is it passes some sort of stimulus bill, generally extends unemployment benefits, does things of that sort, often does things like turn off work requirements for means-tested benefits like this. So even this schedule could be affected by that. And then, of course, there's next November's elections where you could have a different set of policymakers trying to move things in a different direction. That is obviously TBD, but there's reasons to be very skeptical that this dynamic, specifically the work requirements of the One Big Beautiful Bill, are going to play out in a very significant way when it comes to this question. There are big numbers at stake over the long run. So the Medicaid work requirements were supposed to affect something on the order of 5 million able-bodied adults through 2034. The SNAP work requirements, something like 3 million, would no longer be collecting, generally because they're able-bodied and not satisfying the work requirements. So those are pretty big numbers. They could move this. I just don't think they're going to get implemented in time to move this right away.
And just to say something about the ultimate effect of the work requirements in particular, there was a lot of research that came out as the bill was coming up for a vote that suggested that the net effect of it was going to be to cause the bottom fifth of families to lose a lot of income. Now, that remains to be seen. I think the modeling that was done generally suggested that the only effect that work requirements could have on incomes was to lower them. That is, they made no room for the possibility that work requirements will actually lead to more people taking work, getting employment income, and thereby raising their incomes. That's a very strange assumption to make, because we've seen a version of this movie before in 1996 when we passed a big welfare reform bill. There were predictions at the time by a lot of the same folks in some cases. The Urban Institute famously predicted hundreds of thousands of people would be moved into poverty. And I think we don't have a randomized controlled trial, but I think most of the evidence is consistent with the statement that on net, more people ended up better off than they would have versus ended up worse off than they would have as a result of this bill that instituted strong work requirements and time limits. I say strong work requirements and time limits because the other issue that I think hasn't gotten enough attention is that the community engagement requirements that more people in SNAP face and that people in Medicaid now face are fairly modest requirements. So for Medicaid, it starts with, it applies only to able-bodied adults without dependents. If you're in that group, what do you have to do? Well, for 1 month in 6, you have to work the equivalent of 80 hours in a month, 20 hours a week, at an hourly wage of $7.25. If, by the way, you make $12, which is what the median person's minimum wage is, because states have their own minimum wages, you have to work 12 hours a week at $12 an hour for 1 month out of 6, and you will fulfill the work requirement. You also don't actually have to work. You can do volunteering for the same amount of time, or you can invest in yourself through education or workforce development. So I just think a lot of the projections about how the bill is going to affect the income distribution, really had a thumb consistently on the side of the scale to suggest that they're going to be worse for families than they are.
Great. Well, let's stick on work requirements, only because I think on this stage it's probably the issue that we spent among the most time on in the past couple years. Matt, you've had a lot of experience on the Hill in implementing work requirements. And I take your point earlier, Matt, that government policy does not do that much to shape these numbers. At the end of the day, it's mostly about what's going on in the labor market. Are people working? And of course, family structure matters a lot in the long run as well. But back in the 90s, as I think we've all alluded to, you actually did see government policy which did dramatically shift things that you could see in some of this aggregate data. Certainly when you drill down to, say, single moms, where you saw something like a 10 percentage point increase in labor force participation among single moms, where you saw child poverty substantially fall as a result of some of the welfare reforms that we saw in the 90s. And I think it's worth putting into context, as we started to do already, some of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act work requirements. only because I have seen articles out there saying that this actually is the biggest welfare reform ever, and maybe bigger than what we saw in the 90s. And I'd be interested in hearing your take on, is that really the case? Is it just that we're applying work requirements to more people? Are they as intensive? And is there any chance that we will see some of those policy effects encouraging work showing up in the data, even if it's not in the next couple of years, in the long run, if they are actually implemented or not?
Yeah, so by some measures, that's right. Like if you compare the effect of the Medicaid changes in the One Big Beautiful Bill with the primarily TANF, but also some SNAP and some Medicaid and SSI effects in the 1996 welfare reform law, I ran these numbers a while ago, but I think in general, it suggests that from a savings standpoint, it's about double in the One Big Beautiful Bill, just the Medicaid savings compared to the entirety of the 96 welfare reform law, kind of spread out over the first decade. So from that standpoint, I'd say the answer is yes. And from a numbers standpoint, the numbers are very large too. And some of this just owes to Medicaid is a way bigger program than AFDC ever was, and certainly than TANF is now. So when we passed welfare reform in 1996, it was something on the order of, it was like 14 million individuals in 4 million or so households. So you had like something like 4 million adults who were potentially affected. But the work requirements applied to only half. You can slice and dice that different ways. So that's a measure of what was going on then. The Medicaid work requirements, again, CBO has scored this, and you can, question or second guess their estimates, and that's perfectly appropriate. Suggested that something on the order of 5 million adults may no longer be collecting Medicaid in 2034. So it looks really big, but again, that's out of a much bigger program, and that's really without kind of paying much attention to the question of, well, those people are going to be better off because they're going to go to work and they're going to be with an employer who provides them private coverage as opposed to Medicaid, or some combination of coverage through the exchanges. So you can certainly craft an argument that the changes in the One Big Beautiful Bill rival, if not in some ways exceed, the effect of the 96 welfare reform law. Do I think it's going to be as significant a sort of social policy change overall? I don't know, I'm somewhat skeptical. I think welfare reform was a big deal, and it was a big deal for a very focused number of individuals that Congress wanted to, specifically low-income single moms, that Congress wanted to move them off of a situation where they are collecting welfare checks every month, generally not working, and help them be in a different status of going to work, getting married, whatever the thing was going to be that allowed them to leave the welfare rolls. The Medicaid changes, again, you're talking about, what are there, 80 million people on Medicaid now, 71 million, I think, down from 80, approaching 90 million at its peak, are part of a much larger universe, and so seem very big by comparison. I again would argue the 96 reforms were more significant because they were really more focused on a specific set of individuals and trying to move them into work.
And then maybe just before we go on, I want to get into some methodological issues, and then of course leave time for some questions from the audience. But before leaving sort of the political realm, I think it's worth honing in a bit more even on the tariffs and immigration restrictions, only because that's really something that's very different from Trump's first term. Of course, he adopted more tariffs and immigration restrictions, but those have been a lot stronger this time around. And I know, Matt, for instance, you've looked a little bit at the some of the changes in net migration and how that could affect things like the labor market and might translate into the numbers that we see. So what impact do you think there will be on tariffs, and maybe that affects inflation and real incomes and some of the immigration? How does that affect labor markets and demand for labor and wages? And will we see that perhaps diminishing or enhancing some of the success of the second Trump administration relative to the first one?
So I'm not an economist, so let me preface with that. But I think the tariffs are, like Scott suggested, somewhat troubling from the standpoint of job growth. Even job growth in the manufacturing sector has been somewhat passive in recent months. Immigration, same sort of thing. The administration has, this is on the one hand, on the other. On the one hand, they have recently been sort of arguing against the monthly jobs report and saying that they don't give the current labor market enough credit for job creation. But on the same hand, pointing to the same data to suggest that, oh, well, there's been a significant decline in employment among non-native workers and a concurrent rise in employment among native workers. Well, there's a bunch of reasons to be somewhat skeptical of that, including the fact that the administration is saying this is bad on the one hand, but it's good on the other hand, basically the same set of data. So that's kind of a story that will continue to play out. I think overall, you don't have to be much of an economist to recognize that if there are fewer people in the workforce and actually working, that will tend to be a problem for the economy and for economic growth overall. Does it matter if some of those folks are relatively low wage in positions that might be able to be filled by technology that increases productivity and grows the economy in the long run? Again, there's lots of debate about that, but I think we're going to learn a lot more about the impact of the administration's immigration policy, but it clearly tends in the direction of fewer illegals working in positions, probably fewer non-citizens overall working in positions, and more native employment, which, if you give them credit for what they're trying to do, they're looking at a situation where we've had historically elevated African-American unemployment rates in this country. How can one solve for that? It's, in some sense, to make sure that the people in the labor market are those who are legally here and legally able to work, so that if those who are not legally here and not legally able to work are not in those positions, others can occupy those positions. So I'll leave it at that.
Anything else, Scott, before we move on to the super exciting methodological issues on poverty measurement and income measurement?
Yeah, I think we can move on. Maybe tariffs will come up again.
Okay, all right. Well, I think this is now our third annual event on these income and poverty numbers, because I think we want to emphasize their importance and what we learned from them about the well-being of American households. I think the first event that we did was actually mostly focused on methodological issues with regard to poverty measurement. As we've talked about, there's both, as Scott has really hit on, there's official poverty measure and supplemental poverty measure, among many others, like a consumption poverty measure and a full income poverty measure. And so I think that it's worth getting into those issues about how can we make sure that the things that we're measuring are the things that we actually want to measure, so that when we look at things like median household income over time or poverty over time, it's not about 5,000 caveats about like, well, if you have this measure, it says this measure says that. What is the truth about American well-being over time? And so maybe Scott, I'll kick this off to you, because you've already kind of brought up the topic. Really, how big of a deal are some of these issues about, let's say poverty measurement, and how can we fix them? How can the Census Bureau go forward and continue to collect its data in a very rigorous way that it does, dealing with low response rates as well as it can, which it is doing. But how can the Census Bureau make sure that it's providing these kind of summary measures in a way that makes sense and that reflect accurately the well-being of U.S. households?
Yeah, no, I think it's a real problem. I mean, if you're looking at this chart and you're pretty cool with this situation, that paints a pretty clear picture of poverty trends, then, I guess I'd have to disagree with you. A big problem is that there's a lot of consensus, I think, across conservative-leaning, progressive-leaning economists and social scientists about some of the right ways to do this. And where that agreement is that everybody agrees that the way the official poverty measure counts resources as income is just terrible. And it gets abused by people on both sides. Folks on the right, sometimes you'll hear them say, we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. And they're almost always using the official poverty measure when they say that, which, as much as it declines a little bit here, over 50 years, doesn't decline all that much. And on the left, the temptation is to point to a relatively disappointing poverty trend and say we need to expand the welfare state because we've got to get this down. We've got to get the poverty rate lower in this day and age. They're both abusing, often knowingly, this huge shortcoming of the official measure, which is just, it doesn't count very much as income of what we do to try to reduce poverty today. It counts cash benefits. Well, what are the biggest ways that we do reduce poverty? Actually, I'm gonna hold off on that because I think Matt has a lot to say about that. So it doesn't reflect well the resources that we ought to count as income. The supplemental poverty measure does do a good job with that, at least a much better job than the official poverty measure does. But then it does all these things related to setting the threshold, what defines whether somebody's poor or not, if they're above or below these thresholds. I think there's something like 11,000 or 12,000 different thresholds with the SPM.
Oh, it's upward of 30,000.
Yeah, you might be right. It's well in the 5 digits how many different thresholds there are, depending on where you live in the country, depending on your healthcare expenses, depending on whether you're a homeowner or not, I think, all sorts of different things. And it's just, it's as if they've tried to find the one true way of measuring poverty, and they've lost the forest for the trees, or the trees for the forest. Where the consensus is let's measure all the things that we think count as income. And that ought to include a bunch of non-cash benefits that are counted in the SPM, like food stamps that have expanded a lot, tax credits, things like that. Everybody can agree on that. Where we disagree is about the thresholds. Okay, so let's put out a couple different measures. One which do the thresholds that people who like the SPM like, but one that just update it for inflation every year, like this anchored SPM, the dark blue line on this chart does. And secondarily, there's a case to be made that we should have income-based poverty measures and consumption-based poverty measures, which, as you can see, gives very different results too. So that would simplify things at least a little bit, because to the extent people want to pick a line, they can say why they're picking the line. Whereas today, so you've come to AEI to hear 3 right of center people speak, so this will be the time where I sort of say, I think progressives need to decide what they really think counts in a poverty measure. If you were to go to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities website yesterday, still there today, they were talking down the SPM poverty estimate because they were pretty sure that this issue of inflation increasing the thresholds was going to show that in the last year of the Biden administration that poverty didn't go down or maybe even went up. Well, that's something that is in the measure that was, by the way, chosen mostly by progressive researchers. And if you either like it in the years where there's not high inflation and the years where there's high inflation, or you consistently don't like it. Conservatives can say, we don't like that. It doesn't matter whether inflation was high or low. We've been saying it's the wrong way to use the thresholds for years. And then this other issue is sort of how you value health insurance, for instance. I can't tell you how many fights I've had with people to say, we should include health insurance as income. And, oh, you don't think it should be counted as income? Well, then I guess we should zero out Medicare and Medicaid, and it won't affect the poverty rate, so why not? Suddenly, in the tax debate, a bunch of progressives decided we should count health insurance as income, because that was a big reason why you found that the bottom fifth was going to lose income from the tax bill, because a bunch of folks were projected to lose Medicaid. If you count Medicaid as income and that goes away, that's going to lower incomes. But it was interesting to see so many people suddenly arguing that we should count Medicaid as income. So I think we just need to develop some consistency. The other thing where I think there's more progress, and I think, and I don't blame any of these problems that I've just said on Census Bureau folks, and I think Census Bureau folks have done a really good job. Well, I'll give them 2 cheers rather than 3. They've changed the way that they've updated their estimates for inflation over very long periods. It doesn't make too much of a difference over short periods, but if you're looking at 50-year trends, it makes a big difference. In 2022, they started using a different methodology that I won't get into, but essentially what you would get with that old methodology is that top line. It shows median household income rising 22% from 1973 to 2024. Starting in 2022, they adopted a better approach. That's the middle line. That shows a 31% increase over time because the new methodology shows prices rising slower than the old method did. I've argued that a better method, I think very clearly, I wish the Census Bureau had adopted this. All of the logic of what they did would sort of suggest doing what you see in the dashed line. They didn't. But that would show median household income going up by 37%. So even just measuring how much prices change makes a big difference. This is the same thing, but just for median men's earnings. So by the old way, that's a 6% increase over 50 years, which sounds pretty bad. The new way shows a 14% increase over these 51 years. The way that I think is merited would show a 20% increase. We could get into it. I think actually these are all sort of overstating how much inflation there's been, and it's probably more like 30% increase. But regardless, it just shows you how much these measurement differences matter. And I think the Census Bureau deserves some credit for what they've done in this area, but they can transfer some of these lessons over to the poverty measurement side as well.
Would you mind dialing up the...
Yep.
That one, okay.
Yep.
So Scott started making the point about the benefits that are counted in the various poverty measures versus those that are not counted. The blue at the very bottom of this reflects the federal spending on means tested assistance that's counted towards the official poverty measure. The red reflects the federal assistance that's not counted in the official poverty measure, but is counted in the supplemental poverty measure. Now, these two measures have different thresholds, different sort of standards. Scott talked about some of the kind of bizarre pandemic-related threshold issues that have tended to make the SPM less impressive. Basically the SPM was level this year and the OPM declined. But the bottom line is we have competing measures of poverty in this country that tell dramatically different stories because they look to dramatically different sets of benefits that are included in what their bottom line is. And that has only widened over time, right? And some of this is just kind of a tale about the evolution of the safety net in the United States. We have gone from a system that, starting in the 1960s, sort of thought the measure of poverty should be, in effect, your earnings and some welfare checks for low-income folks, and throw in unemployment and Social Security for seniors, and we'll kind of call it a day at that. But how the safety net has evolved has been through all sorts of other things. We added tax credits, EITC in the 1970s, child tax credits in the 1990s. We created and significantly expanded food stamps along the way. We created and significantly expanded Medicaid along the way. So if you have an official measure that is somewhat frozen in time in terms of our thinking about how do you resolve poverty in the 1960s, but then you have a safety net that moves in a completely different direction to provide all sorts of in-kind and tax assistance, much of it focused on low-income households, but choose not to count that. Like Scott said, you can sort of pick your measure, right? Like you can look at the official poverty measure and say, oh, it's stubbornly high. Well, of course it's stubbornly high if more and more of what taxpayers are sacrificing to assist low-income individuals is not counted in your official poverty measure. But now, of course, we have headlines. I noted the Reuters headline about today's report says, U.S. poverty rates not significantly changed in 2024, Census Bureau says. well, wait a second, didn't we just learn that the official poverty measure went down while the supplemental poverty measure, which is reported second, arrived on the scene later, was level? Reuters says the supplemental poverty measure now, not the official poverty measure, is the main gauge of US poverty, and it did not change significantly. So I think you all are, I feel bad for you. You're in this room. Hopefully you enjoyed the snacks and the sandwiches and all that. But we're here talking about the official poverty measure versus the supplemental poverty measure and showing arcane charts and things like this. Most Americans, they just want to know, are we helping poor people? Are there fewer poor people this year than there were last year? Is what taxpayers are doing successful in helping people move up the ladder? And the answer is, well, depending on the year and depending on the measure that you point to, the answer could be yes, no, maybe, something in between, and it has all these additional complexities. You don't have to be too cynical about this place to think that much of this is by design, right? The official poverty measure has been the official poverty measure since the 1960s so that some people can make arguments about the success or failure of the safety net, and as Scott said, it works on both sides, and say, well, the war on poverty spent $5 trillion, but it failed. Well, okay, if you don't count the $5 trillion, of course it failed, right? And then on the left, there's the same sort of thing. You know, this year's poverty rate is stubbornly high because we're going to look at this one measure, the supplemental measure, that has this complexity with its threshold and baseline going back in time. So that's entirely too much detail. I should have stopped it, congratulating you all for being here and withstanding this. But the bottom line is we should come to some rationalization of this in the long run. I would also argue that from a budgetary standpoint, we're facing increasing difficulty going forward. We're already about $1 trillion in interest payments on the debt now, going up to something close to, if not over, $2 trillion within a decade. There's going to be squeezes in all sorts of federal programs over time. Policymakers kind of have a choice going forward, and it's, do they want to have a poverty measure, and do they want to have the public discussion at events like this, and the reporting and the talking is, you know, regular people sort of, you know, if they ever consider these questions, be, hey, what the federal government is doing is actually making things better for people? Or do we want to continue in this sort of decades-long kind of back and forth about, well, depending on which one you use this year, maybe things are improving or they're not improving. I would argue we should have systems that should give taxpayers credit for the efforts that they engage in to help low-income individuals. And right now, we really don't have that, certainly not in the official poverty measure. And to some degree, as Scott said, in the complexity embedded in the supplemental poverty measure, it's, you know, that fails in many key respects too.
Great. Well, we're about to get to our audience questions. I do want to make one final remark about something that Census is doing very well. So if you're in the online audience, you can feel free to start submitting questions, and we'll be getting to those in a minute, and we will be bringing a microphone around for those in the room. But the one other thing I did want to mention that Census Bureau has been working on extensively in the past several years is dealing with another problem. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot about declining response rates. When people are asked to fill out a survey, they don't actually do it, which has problems because it can bias the sample. Another issue is that those who do respond to the surveys don't always respond accurately about all their income sources. It may not be lying, it's just they don't remember all of the income, say, that they receive from earnings or from other transfer programs. And the Census Bureau has been doing a lot of amazing work to try to correct for those problems by linking together surveys with administrative data from tax records and other benefit programs to try to improve the accuracy of survey response. This work goes back to Bruce Meyer, who's at the University of Chicago and at AEI, that's shown how pervasive misreporting of income can be and how you can use linking of administrative data to survey data to correct some of those problems. And so the Census Bureau, I know, has been doing a lot of work there's a lot of research that goes into how you combine those data sets and which source you trust. And they're doing a lot of great work to push forward on that. So I think it's worth pointing out some of these other successes that they've had, especially in terms of improving the accuracy of the underlying data, which is what we really want to make sure we're doing. Okay, so with that, we will open things up to questions. Again, if you're on the online audience, please submit those, and I will be getting to them. But let's start with in the in-person audience. We'll start in the back of the room there, and we'll be getting to all of you, so don't worry. I see you. So in the back, start with, please use the microphone, give your name, and then get to the question.
Wendell Primus, 2 doors that way at Brookings. I want to begin by a compliment. I read the AI bulletin that comes out every day, and there was a great report on how we ought to think about migration and the impact upon our economy by your colleagues in yesterday's report. So thank you for that. I think the official poverty line shouldn't even be printed anymore. I mean, it's worthless completely. But I guess my question to you, and that is, given that and I would say that supplemental rate went up because we haven't done much on the child tax credit. That's why it went up. But the real question in my mind, which I don't have a good answer to, and that is, why has elderly poverty increased under the supplemental measure for the last 4 or 5 years? I mean, it's not a 1 year. And this year, it was a significant increase from 14.2 to 15. I mean, there were only 2 poverty rates that changed significantly. One was elderly, and I think the other one was on non-citizens. So that's my question.
So your point about the child tax credit is partially true. So the dip that Scott showed in the supplemental poverty rate, there was, keep going, or actually it was Kevin's, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Kevin, your original, yeah, that one. So the dip is attributable to lots of pandemic relief provided. Some of that was the expansion of the child tax credit in 2021. The rise, though, was more because, especially if this is focused on households with children, which I don't think this is, was more because of the expiration of unemployment benefits and the sort of temporary nature of the 1, 2, 3 time provision of stimulus checks than it was the expiration of the child tax credit. Child tax credit mattered, but other things mattered more in terms of explaining why poverty, having been driven down in the supplemental poverty measure because of this sort of surge of federal assistance that was provided to individuals and households, then rose when that stuff expired. And you can either have this stuff be temporary or it cannot be temporary, but somehow if it's not temporary, you're gonna have to budget for it and pay for it. And we already have really 2 large deficits, so I take policymakers at their word that this stuff's supposed to be temporary. Listening to the Census Bureau report this morning, that question I think was asked, and I think the answer was because medical out-of-pocket expenses have increased. So your question about elderly and SPM is I think because of that, but again, I heard that in passing and haven't dived into that.
Okay, let's move on to in the front here. We'll kind of work our way over.
Do you worry about the reliability of future reports, given that if a bad number comes out, the person gets fired? What do you think the reliability will be of the 2025 numbers?
That's a really important question. I wrote critically of the Bureau of Labor Statistics commissioner being fired. Over what were revisions that are well within the realm of revisions that we've had in the past, and to the extent that there's a consistent problem of understating or of overstating initially job growth, that's a problem that predates the term of the former commissioner who was let go. I think it's a really, really bad development for a U.S. president to suggest that the people who are in charge of producing our official statistics are manipulating them for political reasons. It's implausible because the number of people who would have to be involved in such a conspiracy, there's just absolutely no way that it could happen. And so it's irresponsible to suggest that sort of thing is happening. I worry because so many people would have to be involved in not only a conspiracy, but so many people would have to go along with demands from a president to cook the books. I don't worry about that happening. I think the people who serve in these roles have a ton of integrity, and what I honestly worry more about would be, sort of mass firings in the event that that a lot of people weren't going to go along with the program. That obviously is incredibly bad optics, and so I don't think that's likely either. It matters who is the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It matters who's in charge of the Census Bureau. But even with a person in that role who was primarily political, I think there's real limits to the damage that could be done to official statistics. And if damage were done, it would be so apparent, it would be such huge news that, I think people would rightly not trust the statistics at all, and that it's hard to see how that would serve anyone over the long run, even a U.S. president. Other countries that have, attempted to manipulate the numbers grossly, it doesn't end well. The real economy remains the real economy, and that underperforms when people don't have confidence in the information that they're getting that they need to make decisions based off of.
All right, we'll come in the back there, and then we'll come to you, and then plenty of time.
Yeah, thank you. Great discussion. Carl Polzer. So my question has to do, it came up a couple of times, the unemployment rate and the puzzle of it, that it might understate the vulnerability of people in that situation. My question is, has anybody looked at the residual, that is the people that say they're not looking for work, and are there really different changes that have occurred there? Like people that now have enough capital to coast for a while. So the inequality factor. People that have a working spouse, so they don't have to look for a job, but they might need to look for a job if there's a shock in the economy. So I just wondered if anybody's looked into that, because that might reveal vulnerabilities of, where a shock could lead to poverty. Does that make sense?
So the BLS reports every month, the not in the labor force, the NILF folks. I don't believe that's changed a whole lot. Not to my knowledge, is the answer that I can give you on that.
I think the big increases have been, it's interesting. I think some of the reasons that the labor force non-participation rate has risen, that is the reason that there are more people who aren't working and not looking for work. Some of them are concerning, but for the most part, it's a lot more ambiguous than that. I'm more familiar with what's happened. So I think the participation rate for women has actually increased post-COVID to new heights, I think. For men, there's sort of a decades-long problem that is primarily about the increased number of men who are not working or looking for work and say they're disabled. That's complicated because a lot of indicators of health have not changed in ways that you would expect the number of non-working disabled people to have increased. It's not that the number of disabled people has risen, it's that conditional on having a disability, whether or not you work, that has declined a lot. So what does that mean? Does that mean there are people taking advantage of federal disability benefits? To some extent, I think that's a real problem. It could also, to some extent, mean that there were a lot of people working in pain and with chronic conditions in the past who no longer have to, and that's maybe a story about rising affluence creating a more generous country. But a lot of the other reasons are sort of, men who are homemakers are still a relatively small group, but it's increased quite a bit over time. A lot of people are in school. A lot of people are retiring earlier than they did. I think most of those categories, if they need to sort of return to the workforce, I sort of think the economy is strong enough. I tend to think that this is really more of a labor supply issue than it is a labor demand issue. I think the economy is strong enough that if folks need to re-enter the economy, for the most part, I think there will be jobs there for them to take.
All right, yep, in front here. Oh, wait, sorry, let's wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you. This is not an expert question. It's about work requirements. Maybe building on what we just heard, you all are exquisitely attuned to the value of government transfers, both cash and non-cash. As you know, your colleague removed, Phil Graham, has really focused on this and also looked up into the income cohorts where you need to tax affect income that working people are receiving. And his very provocative conclusion from that is about 2/3 of Americans earn the same amount after tax and transfer, whether they're working or not. Now, one narrative from that would be, look, if you leave that situation, it is subtly disincentivizing work. And you're also shortchanging people at the bottom because work is good for you. And there are statistics from another of your colleagues, Nick Eberstadt, about guys playing video games all day, very, very somewhat concerning. Anyway, if you could wrap this in the right political message, which I think would be easy to do, namely, look, we want to incentivize work. We want to bring people out into the workforce. Kevin, you're nodding because this isn't a new message. What do you think about the idea of really going hard on this work requirement business, not just as it was done in one big beautiful bill, and it seems to me the Democrats are really just lying about what was in that bill with respect to Medicaid, but really trying to push it where it's appropriate or could be done throughout. Is that just a pipe dream or could that be done?
You looked at me.
Okay.
So, I wouldn't undersell the changes in the one big beautiful bill, right? You're talking about millions of individuals who are currently, at least at the moment, not working, who are going to be expected to do something subject to the caveats that Scott said, right? This is 80 hours a month for 2 months of the year, all that. Could that be strengthened? Absolutely. Is that a significant change from where we are today? Absolutely. Are there things that can be done that go beyond that? Yeah, to me, I think one of the things that was undersold from the 96 welfare reform law, a lot of focus on work requirements, relatively little focus on time limits on benefits, which the left views that as punitive, says, oh, you're going to kick people off of benefits. Another way of looking at that is individual programs need to take seriously that they can offer a certain amount of benefits for somebody and help them during that time develop the skills, ability, whatever, job finding capacity to go off and work and support themselves. To me, that's something that probably should be focused on more, because if you constantly have a safety net that says, well, if you can convince us that you're going to be doing community service for 2 months of the year, you can remain perpetually on Medicaid, and that's going to be okay. That sells people short, right? That doesn't help people necessarily get into work and be able to work and support themselves, which should ultimately be our goal for folks. So there are definitely things that can be done. I think the steps in the one big beautiful bill are pretty significant compared to prior law. But yeah, could policymakers go beyond that? Absolutely.
Okay, I think in the question in the back.
Yes. You've spoken a fair bit about the individual impacts of a lot of policies that have been enacted by the Trump administration, like the one big beautiful bill's work requirements, extension of tax cuts, tariffs, that sort of thing. I'm wondering if you could predict, let's say in a few years from now, after everything's been implemented for a bit, what the overall impact will be on poverty and employment. And by that, I mean actual poverty, not the official rate.
And you don't mean the supplemental rate, I guess, either. I don't know. I guess it's hard to say. I guess it's hard to say. I mean, I guess you look at sort of the near-term labor market data we're seeing. I think maybe a somewhat slowing of the economy, which probably will be the fundamental factor. I don't know. I think the tariffs will, the one-time sort of increase in prices. The immigration stuff, I'm not so sure. There'll be some offsetting effects in terms of maybe increasing demand for some domestic labor, but also it's less demand for other products in other markets. So I don't know. I think probably not that big. I think overall, not that big of an effect overall. But it remains to be seen how the work requirements are enforced, whether they actually go into effect, and just sort of on the Medicaid ones. It's sort of an experiment. We haven't really had Medicaid work requirements before, so even though these are relatively lax compared to what we've seen certainly with cash welfare and even with SNAP, you could see some important employment effects. So I think it's possible you'll see something significant, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's relatively muted overall.
I would argue a big effect will be driven by basically shortages in the labor force, right? Like we are on the cusp of many more people retiring, and we know about the Social Security and Medicare effects of that. Absent large immigration, you're going to continue to have labor demand grow, one would think. And so that, I suspect, will be maybe more important for the picture going forward than probably a significant amount of what we're talking about here. The economy really does drive a lot of this stuff. Anti-poverty programs matter, but whether somebody has a job, what's the nature of their household, that sort of thing really is the fundament on which all the rest of this is built.
And I think I would look at the impact of deficits and tariffs rather than sort of changes to social policy if I were going to watch what's happening to the economy.
Yeah. All right, well, I think that brings us to the end of our event. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you at our next AEI event.
Well done, sir.